Hello, everybody. We're back with Caleb to almost finish Varieties Religious Experience. We've got 2 more chapters left, 2 more lectures left. And you'd normally think this is the last chapter, but this is the chapter just called like miscellaneous, just called other characteristics. So we've got a couple things this is like his catch-up chapter. Just the things that didn't fit into any of the other categories. We're going to talk about them. So, yeah, let's get into it. How does it feel to be almost done?
It feels pretty good. We've been at this for almost a year now.
Yeah,
so
since
it's
like September.
Yeah. So it feels good to bring it to a close.
It's July 28th. If we finish in the next 3 days, we'll have finished. We could finish in July.
Yeah. We can do it.
Maybe let's try that. We could do that.
We can go for it.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah. Okay, we're just planning in front of everybody. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. So the first section that he just reiterates his kind of pragmatism stuff again, and he says the truth is what works, and even if we have to give this qualifier, what works on the whole or what works overall, because everything can be said to work in some specific way towards some specific end, or everything works towards being itself, but what works in this larger sense is harder to define, but it's the most important thing to define. So and that's what he wants to call the truth at the same time. Those things that looked that like they helped for a little bit turned out to not be true at all. They were not the true path. And that's actually one of the more elusive parts of James's pragmatism, which is not as obvious in Peirce, when Peirce disagreed with James a lot on that point, and that's where they split. I might have talked about this last time, but that's what Peirce and James split on. Was Peirce wanted to keep pragmatism as a theory of meaning, not as a theory of truth, whereas James wanted to push it all the way to be everything. But we'll see about that. I haven't read enough Peirce. Peirce was also insane, so that's a good thing. Yeah. But that he just reiterates his normal pragmatist thing again. Then he starts talking about aesthetic elements in religion. You said you had some ideas on that. So like being how beautiful the church is, or how magisterial things look, what feelings of reverence they instill in you and stuff like that.
Yeah. And so he talks about that as being like something that's important in like Catholicism, and then it would also be true for Orthodoxy as well, although he doesn't ever really address it. But the thing that you said that you really didn't get was the Catholicism Protestantism difference that he sets up. And he kind of sets up Protestantism as like shaving away all the like aesthetic value that you get in Catholicism, where Catholicism you have like a honeycomb of like lots of different like theological practices and like different beliefs and different aesthetical things that you're doing. Like you can be a monk, you can be a priest, you have a lot more that you can do within Catholicism. And so like Protestantism tries to shave away all the excess and get to the core theology. And so that's why he thinks that Protestantism like won't convert people well compared to Catholicism, because Catholicism does a better job of like tapping into people's like desire for like an aesthetic like religious experience, and like having something more meaningful than just like raw condensed philosophical theology that you kind of like boil down to in Protestantism.
Mm-hmm. But if we think today about the reasons that people would convert from hierarchical churches to more Protestant churches, it's usually one, because they felt like their former church was just a shell, was all bells, smells and bells, but it wasn't, people weren't being honest. They were there for cultural reasons or something like that. They felt like they were being lied to. I'm sure people are just convinced by like the same reasons that convinced Calvin and Luther, that they thought that the Catholic or Church was heretical or something like that, which is, I mean, that's an intellectual disagreement, I guess.
Yeah.
But also, I think at least today, it's like energy.
Yeah.
That people feel that Protestant churches have a lot more energy, and the music is a lot bigger and more fun, and people go to these churches because they have these huge activities for like kids and stuff.
Yeah.
And people love it. It's like a little circus.
Yeah. And there's also like more freedom in how you can practice, right? So you're not bound by a liturgy. You can kind of play the songs that you want. You have a lot of like wide room of what you can talk about in your like sermons, and so you're not like bound up by like formal practice or anything. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think people look down on, or evangelicals will look down on like liturgical like Catholicism or Orthodoxy because it's so rigid and structured, and they enjoy the more like free environment of like an evangelical non-denominational church.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and this is something that Vanderklay brings up a lot, is his church and their sister church, the RC. He's in the CRC, and there's the RCA as well. And RCA is slightly more liberal with respect to things like gay marriage and stuff like that. So he tells the story of a family whose daughter got pregnant outside marriage, and then they stopped coming to church, and then their pastor or somebody went to their house and said, "Oh, where have you guys been?" And they say, "Oh, we're in the RCA now." So when you have the option to go with the church that is okay with your sin, you're on the margin. People will go for it, as long as they can still have it. And that's not even me saying anything particularly about any sin, but it just makes sense that people, if they have the option to not feel
Guilty.
shame from the community, then they might go for it. That's I'm not telling any tales out of school there. What does that phrase mean? I don't know, but I said it. But yeah, and he calls Protestantism physiognomically repugnant, which that's a phrase that Luke uses sometimes.
I don't know what that means at all.
It just means ugly.
Oh.
But yeah, there is a video by Camille Paglia where she talked about art and the church in history, and she does a lot of She's an atheist, but she does a lot of complaining about what Protestants did to Catholic art, and that Calvin said that, okay, you can sing in church, but it has to be psalms. You can only sing psalms because that's biblical singing, which Protestantism kind of put a choker on creativity in that way. And if you think about like most Protestant art, it ends up being like VeggieTales or something. But there was a video that Vanderklay did with this other guy that changed my mind about VeggieTales. I think it's funny, but I think it's ultimately bad.
Really?
Because like, what does it doesn't really tell you that much about the stories other than the like event narrative of the story, and then they'll boil it down to a moral fact. So kids can separate the moral fact from the meaning of the story itself. And also this guy, I forget his name, he's like a guy with a big beard, and he was involved with Labrie, which I'm not sure what that is. It was some old like Protestant kind of apologetics kind of thing, but and he's in Georgia actually, making puppets. But he said that VeggieTales kind of cutified Bible stories, and so it makes you take them a little bit less seriously and a little bit less austere. And when I think about Bible stories, I don't think about the Bible's version of those stories. I think about the VeggieTales version first. I
Yeah.
cannot. To me, there is no Jericho without slushies. You
Yeah.
know, that is Jericho. I can't separate that anymore because that was the main version of that story that I heard.
Yeah.
And like, what other stories is that like?
They had David and Bathsheba with the guy stealing the
Yeah,
lambs.
the
Yeah.
rubber ducky.
The rubber duckies. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, but that was so disconnected that I think of David and Bathsheba
Mm-hmm.
separately. But Ruth, though, because the story, the one that's
Oh,
the
yeah.
Duke and the Great Pie War or something, that's actually
Yeah.
Ruth. And
Mhm.
now I think of a rhubarb when I think of Ruth. But like, and so like, and that so to be Christian art, it has to be this very explicit textual connection with the Bible. And it ends up really limiting the way that you're able to describe things, I think. And obviously, that's not like a strict way that Protestantism works, but or like it's strictly written down in any church. And it's not like, well, some of them hate Narnia, some Protestants hate Narnia because
Yeah.
it's not biblical enough. But there's this weird feeling that if you don't talk about the Bible and the events of the Bible as historical events, you're kind of like, you're doing something that can be disconnected from Christianity as a whole, or the truth as a whole, or can lead people away from their faith because they might find something that they like that isn't explicitly like the letters Christ, you know? And yeah.
So it ends up like limiting the scope of like their artistic expression, and then you also think it like VeggieTales made like the Bible stories to like childlike, and so you kind of carry that out over into like adulthood and stuff.
Or that the main point of the stories was a bunch of events happened and you learn a lesson at the end of the day, like they're Aesop's fables or something.
Yeah.
Not Aesop's fables, because those aren't supposed to be historic. Like they're just some like anecdote of history rather than this very intricate pattern. And it's not like anyone that was working on VeggieTales like consciously thought of that or was like, but that's what ends up happening if you just treat it like the word that Pajot uses is forensically. Not that they're vegetables, but it's obviously like silly and cute and whatever, but
yeah.
And I think that VeggieTales is like actually funny too. Like it's like the SpongeBob of Christian stuff. Because if you watch it today, it holds up, like the jokes hold up.
Yeah.
Some of the early ones were just like, oh, he's got cheese on his head.
Yeah.
That was a whole joke. He was wearing a yellow hat, and then they went, oh, look, this kid has cheese on his head.
But they did that one spoof of Lord of the Rings, where it was Lord of the Beans. That was really good. I still remember that.
That one's good. Yeah. Okay, let's continue.
Yeah, we kind of got off track a little bit.
That was on. That was totally on. That no kidding. That was totally on track.
All
and
right.
If you don't understand how that was on track, you haven't been watching the videos properly. Okay.
Yeah.
He talks about sacrifice and confession a little bit. He doesn't really go that much into sacrifice, but with confession, he talks about like confession being the beginning of a form of truth telling. So if you want to tell the truth, you have to confess your own sin. And oftentimes you have to confess it in front of a priest. But Protestants, I think they don't need a priest for that process, which obviously you don't necessarily all the time, but it's a good practice to have. And I think it was Vanderklay that said this recently, that there was this switch where Protestant churches stopped even doing public confessions as part of their liturgy, where there used to be a part in the liturgy where they say, I have sinned at this and this and this and this, and everyone says it, and usually before you take communion. And they don't do that anymore. Like Truro does that.
Yeah, there's that prayer or creed or something that they say that they go through that says, I've sinned against God in thought, word, and deed, and stuff. But
but a lot of churches don't even do that.
Don't do that
because that's the annoying part to people.
Yeah, I think that's done all across Anglican churches, because at EVA, the conference at InterVarsity, there was an Anglican guy who was a speaker, and he had everyone do that. And so I think it's like common across Anglican churches.
Hmm.
I think James also had
Well,
a
it's
really good,
just because they take the liturgy,
yeah,
and it's in the liturgy.
yeah.
Hmm.
And I think James made another good point about confession of it, like destroy an attempt to like destroy the mismatch between like your how you feel internally and how you're seen externally. So when you're like failing to confess, so you know your sins, but you're putting on like an outward facing facade of like being a good and moral person, and so being able to confess like alleviates that tension between how you're viewed by people and how you're viewed by yourself, and it kind of like it levels things out a little bit.
Yeah, and if you are with someone else and they ask you, did you sin? You have to say no or yes. And if you say no, you're probably lying. I mean, if it's about a specific sin or something,
Yeah,
if you say no, you're probably lying. But if no one asks you, you cannot say anything and get by with just, oh well, no one's asked me, so
yeah,
I'm not confessing it. But
yeah,
if somebody asks you and all of a sudden you panic and go like, no, I haven't done anything wrong, then you know to yourself that you're already lying.
yeah,
Whereas if no one asks you, you can pretend to not be lying,
yeah,
where you're lying in any case, really.
mhm,
But
yeah,
in one, you get to pretend to not be lying, to yourself at least. So it's a way of, even if you lie to the priest, it adds another layer of guilt that you lie another time.
yeah,
If you have guilt at all, which is, if you don't, then you have another problem.
yeah.
Um,
Very serious problem.
yeah. And Pascal says in his Pensée that the one of the reasons for the Protestant Reformation was that Protestants didn't want to confess in front of a priest anymore, which I think is just false, but whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, then let's talk about prayer, because prayer is what he spends like a large portion of this chapter talking about. And he talks about, he talks about petitionary prayer, which would just be like, oh, please, like, I'm going to, like, let me get a royal flush or something like that. And he goes like,
Yeah.
I don't know, that exists and people do it, and they're not always lying when they do it, but I'm not like, what are we going to do, a test on whether or not that's true? I don't know. But he also says that prayer, inward reflectiveness, is the soul of religion, the most important part of it, and that natural theology on its own can't be really religion because it doesn't have prayer.
Mhm.
And other than that, it's just abstraction, and man and God remain remote from one another. And it's also what distinguishes religion from just a moral code or a series of aesthetics. It's the active. It's one time I thought in virtue ethics, faith, or the actions that you do are sort of byproducts of the virtues that you have, right? So
Yeah.
a courageous person runs into battle, but it's not the running into battle that is the courage, it's the courage, and the running into battle is the outcome of it.
Yeah.
So one time I thought, what is the outcome of the virtue of faith? Because faith is a virtue in Aquinas's set and in C.S. Lewis as well. It's prayer, essentially. Prayer is just the act of being faithful in the
Yeah.
first place. It's just what we call that, and it manifests itself differently. There's different traditions of prayer and how to pray and what to do while you pray or what to say, but that is what faithful people do,
Mhm.
period. Like in Orthodox churches, you can light a candle, and that is a prayer.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think I think he did a really good job of like pointing out the inwardness that you get with prayer. And I think that's definitely right. But I think there's another aspect that you'll get in more liturgical churches where you pray out loud together. And so instead of that being about like inward reflection, it's a lot more, it seems like, looking beyond yourself and being a part of a community and doing something as a whole instead of doing something as like yourself. So like where one is like looking within yourself to like talk to God, the other is like transcending yourself while you're talking to God and like doing it as a body instead of an individual.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he kind of like he hits all his points right, but that's another thing that he could have brought out in prayer that I don't think he got as much, because you don't really do that as much in Protestant churches.
And I'm thinking in Islam too, the way that they have prayer 5 times a day, all in the same
Yeah,
direction, is a very communal experience, even if people aren't even next to each other. You know,
yeah, it's very
I
outside of
don't
yourself. Yeah,
I don't know the exact specifics of that. Like what time does everyone do it at the same time of day?
yeah, I think so. So it's based on like what it'd be based on what time zone you're in. So it's
Right.
not, yeah. So I think there's like a morning, like a mid-morning one between like breakfast and lunch, then a lunch, then like a dinner, and then like an evening before you go to bed one.
Hmm. That's cool.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, but he does he does he keeps getting back to the point where he's like, I know what you're thinking, right? That when I
Yeah,
say prayer, I just mean, when I say that prayer has a real effect on the world, I just mean that it's some kind of inward psychological effect. And he
yeah,
says, though it obviously is to some degree, all that I need to say, like this is basically like what he tries to do the whole book, because he's going across all kinds of religious traditions and all kinds of experiences. He
yeah,
just has very loose definitions that he says you have to concede, basically. That prayer, so the one that he lands on is, um, whether or not it adds a genuine act to the world that releases otherwise bound energy. The prayer is not indeed a purely subjective thing. It means a real increase in intensity of absorption of spiritual power or grace, but we do not know enough of what takes place in the spiritual world to know how the prayer operates, who is cognizant of it, or through what channel the grace is given. Which, those things were never part of the, like, describing how God's ears work was never the part, is
yeah,
never studied in prayer, you know,
mm,
essentially.
yeah,
And there's the faith that he listens, and then how to say it.
yeah,
Those are the traditions that have developed. And but describing the hearing and God's actions was never the point.
mm,
It's just the faith that you should do it.
yeah,
Yeah. So, and I think that the the best way to think about it is the degree to which you pray is a measure of your faith, your inward faith.
yeah,
So do you pray means do you have faith? They're synonymous questions, essentially. And obviously, like, somebody cannot pray for extraneous reasons, but
yeah. And someone can pray even though they don't have faith and they're doing it out of like some kind of habit. So it's not like a perfect one-for-one matchup,
yeah,
but it's like a
yeah,
good
yeah, yeah, yeah.
indicator. Yeah,
Yeah. So then he goes through a bunch of like examples of prayer, or different people that are doing different things, and he talks about this guy Mueller, who was like a charity man and gave everything away, and was very he would pray for trust, that he would pray for everything that he needs, right? And then never ask for additional things that he wants, but he would get those too. Because because by only desiring, I don't know exactly what the point of this was. He wasn't, but James uses him as an example of where prayer is not just a philosophical thing he's doing, but it's a very like practical exchange that he's doing with God. That
yeah,
um, and he said that he never took out loans either, because there's the chance that he can expect God to answer his prayer and give him enough to pay off the loan, but he knows that he's not supposed to trust God in that way. And if he does, and then he's disappointed, he will lose faith whether or not he ever should have expected it.
Yeah. He
So he
doesn't
doesn't
put
set him up. Yeah.
Oh yeah. He doesn't put any time constraints on his prayers. So he like prays that he'll have enough food or enough money, but he won't say I need this amount of money or I need this food to have like this certain meal or whatever. And so he like prays for things generally and then trusts God to take care of the specifics or something like that
Yeah.
along that lines.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I'm not sure what to think, but because people can put you in like a little trap where you're like, yeah, if you don't expect anything, then every prayer is answered or something, right? So how do you know it's real? But it's a little bit missing the point, a little bit not. I'm not sure.
yeah.
I'm not really sure what to think about it. But he talks about another level of prayer where if you're praying properly, you can focus to a degree that you can have your prayer becomes synonymous with you walking into situations that God wants you to walk into, or that you're not afraid of things around you that might otherwise scare you. And in the Discord reading group that I'm in, we read Lilith, and there's this scene in Lilith where the main character is with all of these children who are like somehow it's not clear what their situation is, but they're to some degree innocent, and they like they just they walk through this like valley, this like terrible valley, and all the children are like unfazed by all these monsters because they're not disconnected from God.
Yeah.
And so all of these children are given you know, a sense of that that through their prayer they have faith that they can get through the situation fine. They to the extent that they don't even notice that there's something that could not go wrong.
Yeah.
That could go wrong. And so the quote is, I think this is from someone else, not directly James. By cultivating the continuous sense of our connection with the power that made things as they are, we are tempered more towardly for their reception. The outward face of nature need not alter, but the expressions of meaning in it alter. And this is similar to some things that Pajot has said on free will, but he's borrowing from St. Maximus, where the freedom is having a connection to the principle that caused you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can sustain your own causation directly through that faith, then the outside things can't have an effect on you. I'm not sure how to describe it, but free will is choosing God. That's what free will means. And then the other things are not free will. You're either a slave or you're free.
I'll have to see what Peugeot says on that because that's
Yeah.
a lot to process.
And it's a better way to read Paul on free will is free will means salvation. It's not like you have free will and then you choose Jesus or not.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Western conception of free will.
I'll have to check that out. Yeah. This reminded me of stuff that Dr. Klein talks about on like information interpretation and judgment. They talked about how you can, like through prayer, you can come and see something that you've seen 1,000 times, but be in a different spirit and see it completely different. And it's you see like God's glory in it and something that you wouldn't have seen it earlier. And so like nothing has physically changed at all other than like your mindset and your like perception and receptivity to something. And so something that was at one time ordinary is now out of the ordinary and like mind blowing. And so prayer is like a way that we can alter our interpretation of the world, even though you're not like changing the base information.
And like spirits then are interpretation and judgment deciders. They're these things that can help you with your interpretation or your judgment. So if there's a spirit of this I think in terms of academia, so if there's a spirit of this kind of idea in a discipline, then people start interpreting things this way, you know?
Yeah.
And I watched a Peterson lecture today on, I was just going through his personality series because I've never really gone through his full lecture series before, but he was essentially, I think that it's right that when we talk about perception, we use our eyes as the vision system, as the main analog for perception, right? You see things, and then you receive what they are. This is an object, this is the computer here, this is a cup, this is my phone or whatever, and you receive that, and then you start interpreting things about them, right? And this is like the Hume problems. All the Hume perception problems are from this kind of perception, right? But that ignores the way that all the other senses interact and the way that we interact over time to continue to perceive. So when I see the computer, I'm also seeing you.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing talking to you. And I'm seeing me, and I'm seeing making the video all at the same time while I'm watching this.
Yeah.
Right? So like, think about like bugs that see with their antenna. Like, are they seeing? Are they not perceiving in the same way? They learn through action. They have perception through action. So you can have a person, and so like you perceive a person's soul over time by interacting with them. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I've never seen that side of them before. People say that, and you can only see the multiple sides over time.
Yeah. And through
So
very
just a
stuff.
snapshot vision, you don't see anything, really.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think that you never stop seeing. Or
Yeah.
you dream, but you're not. It's not. Your life hasn't stopped yet.
Yeah. You're still.
Even though you feel like there's times of speed, you feel like it speeds up, slows down, and you rest sometimes, but it hasn't stopped yet.
Yeah. And you're visualizing stuff even if your eyes are closed. Is that what you're saying? Or like perceiving things? I don't really follow that.
I'm not really talking about vision when I say seeing.
Yeah.
You're kind of you haven't stopped experiencing yet. Name a time that you stopped experiencing. You can't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Always
Exciting.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they start talking, because of this, that the world to us looks the same. This was another long diatribe that he copied from someone else, but the universe looks the same to us as it did to our forefathers. This is the same kind of thing. We act as if they saw like magic everywhere, but they did probably see like sand the same way that we did, or whatever, or trees and stuff. But what's changed is us, and we decided to interpret things more materialistically. So we decided to interpret God out of the thing, and so we have to wait around for miracles to be amazed.
Yeah.
And miracles. I haven't read C.S. Lewis Miracles, but I think this is the point of it: is that everything is a miracle, and then the things that we call miracles are just sped up normalness of God, or intensified normalness of God. And this guy describes we should be more interested in the regularities of the world, because that's the time that God spends the most time on. That's the thing that God spends the most time. Not that God like spends time like that,
Yeah. But he's
like
doing more continuously.
Yeah.
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 Then he says, the fundamental religious point is that in prayer, spiritual energy, which otherwise would slumber, does become active, and spiritual work of some kind is effected really. That's his sum up on prayer. And then he talks about, the next section is on automatisms, which means like people doing automatic things. There's not really much to say here. He just talks about this happens a lot in like big religious figures, and they'll like write subconsciously. It's obviously a big deal for Jewish prophets. It's obviously a big deal for Muhammad, and then he talks about Joseph Smith, right? As all religious figures who this has happened to.
Yeah.
Um,
He had another section on automatisms somewhere else. I can't remember.
yeah, he did. He did.
Um,
One of the earlier chapters.
yeah, one of the earlier chapters. I don't remember which one it was, but yeah, he kind of circled around back to it, um, and just kind of showed its connection with certain religions over others.
Hmm. Yeah, and he said something about Jewish prophets that I didn't know, is that they had like schools of prophets where people
Yeah,
would like train to be prophets, which is interesting. Um,
yeah,
yeah, but it makes you think about, this is one of the points against Islam or against something like Mormonism, is that they are very heavily reliant on us. Well, not even so much against Mormonism, because they claim at least to have a tradition of prophets. The president of the church talks directly to God, right?
yeah,
So they have, but like Muhammad, it's like he is the last prophet. That's a very important part, right?
yeah,
And so, but the Jewish prophets, he says it's incredible how much convergence that they have between all these prophets over a long period of time, to
yeah.
the extent that you can't draw out like an obvious like secret political motive behind these things,
Yeah.
like prophets probably genuinely had similar visions about these things.
Hmm. Yeah.
Hmm. But yeah, and he says the same thing about George Fox, but he says those are a little bit softer, Fox's revelations. But the
Yeah.
important conclusion that he comes to with this is that all effective initiators of change, it requires some kind of revelatory, exciting piece of the truth, or else people aren't going to follow you.
Yeah.
So you never see like revolutions in even a science because of somebody's like offhand like criticism of a paper or something like that. But you do see them because of some new exciting way to do a science, right?
Mhm.
So like Marxism had a big exciting wave, and the marginal revolution was it was a revolution because there was a vision about how utility functions work. And
Yeah.
Chicago theory and public choice theory and all these different things, they have like a clear, like a revelation kind of thing with them.
Hmm.
All of Adam Smith in a way too. So
Yeah.
yeah, and somebody's got to be exciting.
Yeah.
Like scientists like to think that their boring papers are going to do something important, but they're definitely not. They're just going to make other scientists more boring. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he talks about this religion is like it's coming up from the subliminal. And he doesn't mean that as like it's a lesser thing, but it's just like it's coming from outside of your normal stream of conscious, like your normal experience. So like when you have like a vision or you have like some kind of interpretive shift during prayer or something like that, is coming outside of your normal like flow of how you're thinking, as like
Mm-hmm.
it's coming outside of yourself or coming from somewhere within you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just got to be honest that the religious experiences that anyone's ever talked about, it's not just like you think like, oh yeah, I should do the dishes. Like, oh yeah, I should follow this God.
Yeah.
It's not the same kind of thought. That's all he's saying.
Yeah.
Subliminal means like under the normal. It's kind of feeding. It's almost complementary in the way that it's feeding. It's what he's talked about in the earlier chapters about thing from the outside as opposed to the hot normal stuff.
Yeah.
Where did he talk about that in the conversion chapter?
Yeah. Where
Yeah.
like your center of like consciousness or something is like a hot spot, and like a conversion is a shift from one to the other. And so like the sudden ones, it's like where it switches all of a sudden, but it's like underneath things have been changing. And then other ones, it's like people's center of consciousness moves along, like their conscious and like unconscious move together so they can see themselves progressing over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then next week he's going to answer all of our questions.
What I've been
Maybe.
waiting for. Yeah.
He's going to unleash. And then he has a postscript, which was not part of the original lectures, but it was released with the book. And this is where he gives more definitively his actual beliefs, which is the really exciting part. Right? So,
Yeah.
okay. Next week. Last one.
Alrighty.
See you later.